I'm fascinated by how we manage the scenario when we don't have the right data or information, you know. So I'd be interested in your experiences and how did you start? Didn't you find yourself in a loop where you say, hey, we think this is a problem, and then someone says, no, there's no data, so it can't be a problem? I had a great conversation with an American asset manager when I was in New York 2 years ago. This is a major asset manager, and they were basically saying that climate risk is not a real thing until we can get asset level data. And we can't get asset level data for our buildings across the US, therefore we can't even table it at the board. Now, that seems like a pretty destructive position to take. So how did you survive those early days of getting action without necessarily having the data?
Do you want to start?
Okay. So I think the good framework to think of it is the colleague that presented those slides up here around that participatory. There's the one chart you had up was around just getting on and starting, right? And I think that's what we did at Transnet. We said, look, we've got to start somewhere. I mean, we didn't have money to go straight to the CSR to do the scale down models because it cost quite a bit of money. And considering the size of Transnet, to get scale down models at 1 by 1 kilometer resolution would be in the probably hundreds of millions to do that across the business. So we started with scenarios and we said, look, 2-degree scenario, 4-degree scenario, what are the weather variables in a very superficial kind of way, and the LTAS guided us there. So that was really our starting point, was the long-term adaptation scenarios by government. We use that as the proxy starting point. And then the iterative process is each time you do a little more, you manage to get a little more granularity into the process. And then how we really got a step change is when we drilled into the risk data system of the rail business. So the risk data system, like any company's risk system, is a data system in which all risks for the business are logged. Now, those risks are not weather related, they're risks that stop business at some point. We got that database. It was about 15 years worth of data in there. We took that, and luckily we had access to some data scientists, or a data scientist, and he cleaned that data set for us for about 4 months, just cleaning that data set to only bring out the weather-related data. And we took that weather-related data and then we matched it to the operating schedule for the trains over that time frame, right? We did that matching and then we matched it from there to the SAP system money, right? The revenue systems. So we get those 3 data sets to line up together, and then you're now able to go from data to information to knowledge historically, right? Because you're looking back. So that was kind of step 1. Then we took that, and we still don't have access to any climate models. So we said, well, what if we just do on a P50 look ahead on RCP 8.5 and RCP 2? What would this do to revenue on some sort of statistical modeling approach? And we got some outcomes from them. So it's not perfect, but it was a starting point, and it was enough to build consensus in the business that, hey, we need to take action on the following variables.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say statistical modeling, are we talking a cool spreadsheet? Are we talking SPSS?
We're talking...
What kind of skill level are we talking?
You're talking deep skills on modeling using Python and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
So for us, it was a little bit of both and more. So from a risk perspective, I think we followed exactly the same route, understanding from incidents that are being reported on SAP, which ones are weather related, which ones are not. Has that been recorded as a continuous or is that incident reported every 2 months, or is it every season? So we had to go back. So Luckily, we had data up until 1970. So between 1970 and 2000, we had some of that data before SEP times. So some of that information we have internally. And it hasn't stopped, that work. That work continues. And it's not even run from a climate change perspective, it's run from a risk and resilience perspective. So the resilience committees across the country, they'll be able to tell you what incidents have happened, which of those incidents that have happened are weather related. And then the second part for us, it's partnerships. We wouldn't have done the work with the CSRR if the CSRR had not said to us, let's form a partnership around this. How much can you put on the table? This is how much you're willing to put on the table. And we've done the same with the South African Weather Services. And I must say that data and information which has come out of that, we've been able to take their data and our data, the information coming out of their models, and basically trying to validate whether what we've been communicating to the business, does it talk to what they've been communicating to us? That's another element, I think, when it comes to, we always get a question, once you have this data, what are you going to do about it? This information, so what do I do about it? And I think that's an element which we constantly grappling with within our businesses, and I'm sure it's the same at Transnet. It's all good and well to understand what the climate impacts are going to be, but then so what? And who's going to receive that information? And by the time you get into costing the impacts of climate change, I mean, for us, and I've said this before in the past, for us, when you take TCFD, that's where the private sector needs to come in, I think, to assist us. And we're at a point where we understand what we're vulnerable to. We understand our impact in the long term. We're moving away from Eskom from understanding long-term climate change impacts. We're going to seasonal forecasts because we need to understand these long-term projections that we've made for ourselves up until we've actually done them until 2050, because that's where our integrated energy planning takes us as a country. We're now moving into seasonal forecasting. And this seasonal forecasting, one of the key objectives of this seasonal forecasting is to validate the models that we've generated for the long term. And we started from 2021 to 2050. So from next year, we want to see our seasonal forecast as it talks to our long-term projection. And again, that still talks to the impacts, understanding our impacts. However, the financial side, that's where your asset managers come in. We can tell you how we're going to be impacted, our systems, our infrastructure, our systems, how they're going to be impacted. But now we need to put REN values around that, because it's what our boards are expecting us to inform them. They're expecting that information from us. So for us, it may be, for other people, maybe other, for us, it's our stakeholders who are asking us, we know you're vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What does that mean in REN value? And that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, one, I don't know if we need an answer now, but I mean, it would be interesting. Another area of adaptation, which is a bit slightly iterative, is that there's supply chain risk in as well, and customer risk. So both Eskom and Transnet are highly exposed to impacts on the coal markets, which aren't adaptation per se, but they are about responses to climate change, are going to affect the coal markets, are going to be deeply impactful on both their businesses. And I mean, I think it's important, we need to understand also when we're investing in an enterprise, because an enterprise relies on its customers. If those customers change, everything changes. So I mean, that's just a point to raise. And then, I mean, maybe just to say, just so I can say it, is, I mean, it's just, from the side of the private sector also sort of just putting some money where its mouth is, as it were, I think the areas we're looking at would be areas where there can be efficiency in the system, or where there are inefficiencies at the moment, because that's effectively where money can be made. So it's about food wastage. It could be those kind of supply chains. It could be new HVAC. Those kind of things. It could be a lot in the water use, water efficiency, the areas. So those are kind of areas where there's inefficiency at the moment. If the private sector can come in and make it more efficient, you can make money, but you can also adapt. And I think those are the areas that we would probably first look at, as well as new technology that comes in on the back of that. So, for example, if there's no till agriculture, for example, then there's new equipment. If there's smarter agriculture, if there's seeding by drones, etc., whatever there is, those are new areas that private investment will naturally be drawn to. But and I don't know how I'm on this point, but I definitely feel there are some areas where there are big potential interventions. I can't remember what the Claude was saying. I mean, we need to think about the grand projects, or the big investments, that we can look at. I think some of those probably need government to be part of in some way. So, for example, I mean, there's the agriculture side, which I think is massive. Another one, for example, would be non-revenue water. Our cities are throwing away 30 to 40% of their water all the time. It's classically an adaptation project. I would argue the private sector wants to be involved. But I would also argue, I'd stand my ground that the private sector can't get involved unless the public sector wants him to and is receptive, and unless we've got proper governance at that municipal level. So there's a lot of stuff that, what worries me a little bit is you talk about putting in, improved governance, integrating adaptation into systems, etc. Part of it must be simply making the existing systems work properly. Because if the existing systems work properly, then it allows these kind of interventions to happen. And some of the reasons why they aren't happening is, and I have to admit it, is that some of the existing systems, the governance systems, aren't working properly. And we must admit that and kind of work on that. And I think that will help kind of crowding.
And do you think that these small projects provide us clues as to what the bigger projects are?
Yeah, definitely. I think you learn by pilots and, for sure.
Yeah.
And
I mean, just to add on from a financial, we've only started engaging with our treasury and our asset management and our financial guys in the last 2-3 years. So for the last 7 years, 10 years, those are the people we've not been able to attract into the space that is within the business. So all of a sudden, we are attracting guys from the treasury. We are attracting insurance guys within the business because they want to understand the financial implications of this. They're asking us about targets, matrices around this. So I think for us, it's exciting times, but we are being forced into putting rand values around this, which I think that's where the issue of partnerships come in, which is where we can also learn from the pilot projects. You're asking whether if pilot projects can start telling us how they are putting rand values in financial implications, and if they can start telling us about targets, the matrices that they're using, that can help us because that's something that we're grappling with. We've got big assets and all of it, but those are some of the things that we're grappling with. But for us, we're looking into those small pilot projects that are happening across the country to inform us on what they're doing. Yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, just on that coal thing, the insurance thing, I had a conversation with a major global insurer today, and they were basically saying from 2022 they will not insure coal or oil or gas assets, which is, from a systems risk perspective, that's huge.
Yeah.